Operations masters. Back in the days of NT4, you had one master domain controller, the primary domain controller, or PDC, and this server held a copy of the SAM file that contained all of the user accounts in your domain. Then you had a bunch of backup domain controllers, or BDCs, that were secondary, read-only copies of the PDC. Now these BDCs could authenticate users so that they could log on, access files, and go about their daily work, but they relied on the PDC to update them with any changes. In Active Directory, things have changed, and Windows domains moved from a centralized PDC model to a decentralized model using multi-master replication, where changes could be made on any domain controller and then replicated to all the other domain controllers. Great, so Active Directory moved us away from relying on one server being available, the PDC, in order for us to administer our domain. Or has it? Well, yes and no. Active Directory certainly does allow us to make changes to any domain controller, and that's a huge plus, but we still rely on certain domain controllers being available for certain tasks. Active Directory uses the concept of operations masters for critical operations that require a particular server to take charge of specific tasks. Now the term operations masters is technically the correct term to be using nowadays, but back in the early days of Windows 2000 you might have heard it called the Flexible Single Master of Operation, or FSMOs as it was often referred to as. In fact, you'll also hear it called Domain Naming FSMO, or Domain Naming Operations Master. So take your pick, all of them refer to the same thing, but Operations Master is the official term used in Windows 2003. So what is an Operations Master? Well, an Operations Master is a domain controller that holds one of 5 roles: the schema role, the domain naming role, the RID, PDC, and infrastructure roles. And it's important to understand that the first domain controller you install will assume all of these 5 roles. Now the first 2 roles, the schema and the domain naming role, are referred to as forest roles, whereas the remaining 3 roles, the RID, PDC, and infrastructure roles, are domain roles. Now this simply means that with forest roles, there will only be one server that holds that role in the entire forest, whereas with domain roles, there will be one server that holds an operations role in each domain. Okay, so let's go and take a look at each of these in order. The first role we have is the schema role. The Active Directory schema refers to the structure of the Active Directory database. In other words, what fields are contained inside the Active Directory database. Now there's only one server that holds the schema operations master role in your entire forest. So even if you have multiple domains, the server that holds the schema role will be required when schema changes are needed. Now we can take a look at the Active Directory schema using an MMC snap-in tool, but it isn't directly available from our administrative tools. So to access it, we'll first click on Start, Run, and then we'll type in regserver32, followed by the Schema Management DLL, and then we'll click on OK. And if everything goes well, you'll see the DLL being registered successfully. Okay, now we'll click on Start again, and then Run, then we'll type in MMC, and then we'll hit Enter. And this will of course open up a blank MMC console. So now we'll go to our File menu, and we'll select Add Remove Snap-in. Now because this is a blank MMC, we'll need to come down here and click on the Add button. And over here on the right hand side, we can now see the Active Directory schema option has been installed for us to choose. So we'll select that, choose Add, then choose Close, and now we'll choose OK. Alright, now I'll just expand this MMC to make it a little bit easier for us to view here. Okay, now whilst the topic of this video isn't an in-depth look at Active Directory schema, to make understanding the schema a little easier, we'll take a brief look at it. So underneath our Active Directory schema, we have 2 folders, Classes and Attributes. If we select Classes, we can see a whole list of Active Directory classes on the right hand side of our MMC. And in fact, if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see the User class, one of the most common classes that you as an administrator will be using. Now if we right click on the User class and select Properties, and then we'll go to our Attributes tab, we can see all of the attributes that are valid for the user class. And this includes things like when their account expires, how many times they've entered in an incorrect password, And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom here of the list, you'll see things like their user principal name. In other words, all of the things you expect to find in Active Directory users and computers when you select the properties of your user account, you'll find here, and a few more as well. Okay, if we click Cancel and then click on our Attributes folder, we'll get a list of all of the attributes in our Active Directory schema. And as you can see, there are lots. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Schema Operations Master role? Well, when you install an application that integrates with Active Directory, and an example of that would be Exchange Server 2003 or ISA Server or SMS 2003, all of these modify the schema. Now you'll need to have your Schema Operations Master up and running, or these applications will fail to install because the schema can't be modified. Now remember, you only have one Schema Operations Master server for your entire forest, so when you need to make schema changes, you'll be affecting the schema for everything in the forest, not just one domain. Now in smaller companies, and those with only one domains, this normally isn't a problem. But in larger companies with lots of domains, making schema changes will need those changes replicated to every domain controller in the forest, and that can take some time. A simple solution to overcome this problem, at least while you're rolling out your domain controllers, is if you know you're going to be installing ISA Server or Exchange Server or some other product that needs to extend the Active Directory schema, then perform the schema extension as part of the installation as early as possible, even if you aren't planning on installing the application for a few months. That way, your other domain controllers won't be hit for a performance penalty later, and you can launch straight into install the application without having to wait for replication to occur. Okay, so we know that the Schema Operations Master is required to extend the schema. But what if it's unavailable? Well, we can't extend the schema for a start, so we've got two choices. Now, in the event that we know we're going to need to install an application that extends our schema, but we anticipate that the server that holds the Schema Operations Master role will be down, say for maintenance, then we can simply transfer the role to another domain controller. Although in my opinion, it's pretty unlikely that you will shut down your Schema Master for maintenance at the same time you want to extend the schema, but hey, anything's possible, I guess. So to transfer the role, we'll right-click on Active Directory Schema and choose Change Domain Controller. Now down here we can see that we're currently connected to server01.testdomain.com. That's our current server, but what we want to do is connect to a different domain controller, and then we'll transfer the role to that domain controller. So down here we've got the option of selecting any domain controller or specifying a domain controller that we wish to connect to and transfer the role to that one. So I'll choose Specify Name, and over here on the right I'll change the name to server02.testdomain.com, and then we'll click on OK. Alright, now we are connected to server02.testdomain.com, and the only reference you can really see to that is that it has changed up the top here. So what we'll do now is we'll right click on our Active Directory schema again, and we'll choose Operations Master. Now here under our Change Schema Master, we can see that our current Schema Master, which is online, is server01.testdomain.com. And down here we can transfer the Schema Master role to this box, server02.testdomain.com, or the server that we're currently connected to. Now it's important to understand that in order to be able to change the schema role to another server, you need to be a member of the Schema Admins group to perform this change. So we'll simply click on Change, we'll get a message asking us, are we sure we want to do this? Yes, we are. And we can see that the Operations Master role has successfully been transferred across to Server02. So we'll click on OK. And now we can see that our dialog box back here has changed to represent our current Schema Master as now being Server02. So we'll click on Close. Now this is easy. Transferring the schema role to another server while both servers are up happens pretty painlessly. But what happens if the current Schema Operations Master dies unexpectedly? Well, this can certainly prevent you from logging on and transferring the role in an orderly fashion like we just saw. So in situations like this, where the server holding an Operations Master role is unavailable, we can seize the role and bring it across to another server that way. Now I might add at this point that seizing a role from another domain controller is a drastic measure, and Microsoft only recommends seizing roles from domain controllers that will be removed from your network permanently. So bear that in mind and plan to transfer the role, if at all possible, like you just saw, or plan to build a new domain controller to replace the old one if you do decide to plug that failed server back into your network. Okay, so the first thing that you'll need to do when seizing a role is to connect to the computer that you want to assume the operations master role and then open up a command prompt. So we'll use the ntds command to seize our schema master role. So we'll go and click on start and we'll open up a command prompt. So now we'll type in ntdsutil and hit enter. And you can see that our prompt changes to represent the fact that we're now in directory services mode. Now at this point you can type in a question mark and hit enter and see what options you have available if you get stuck. Okay, well we want to transfer a role, so we'll type in roles and hit enter, and our prompt changes to show that we are in the first server of operations maintenance mode, or FSMO maintenance mode, that we're in now. Now at this point we're not actually connected to this server with ntdsutil, or even any server for that matter, even though we are running the command on this server. So to connect to our server, we'll first have to type in connections, and this will get us into connections mode. And now we need to tell the utility which server we want to connect to. So we'll type in connect to server, followed by the name of the server that we want to connect to. Now in our case, we've recently transferred our schema operations master role to server 02 from the original server, which was server 01. So why don't we go and seize the role back again? So we'll type in server 01 and hit enter. Now we can see that it's bound to server 01 using the credentials of the locally logged on user, which in our case is the administrator account. So now we can type in quit, and this simply takes us back to our previous menu. Now at this point, I'll type in a question mark and hit enter, and you can see from this point on that we can use ntdsutil to either seize the various operations master roles or transfer them, as we saw earlier, using our Active Directory schema MMC. Okay, so we'll assume that our server 02 that holds the schema operations master role has just gone belly up. So to seize the role now and bring it to this computer, we'd simply type in seize schema master, and that's it. So we'll hit enter, and now we get a message asking us if we really want to perform this task, so we'll say yes. Now, something important to note amongst all of this output here is that even though we chose to seize the schema operations master role from server 02, because there is a valid connection that still exists to server 02, our attempt to seize the role wasn't needed. Instead, NTDS transferred it across to our server 01 the graceful way. Now if we want to seize or transfer one of the other roles, simply type in a question mark again and you'll see the syntax for any of these other roles here. So for example, we could seize the PDC or the RID master role, or of course we could transfer it doing it the graceful way. So as you can see, it's a pretty easy process using the command line, but from this point on in this video, we'll concentrate on using the GUI tools. Now just bear in mind, if you do want to seize a role, you'll need to come in here into the ntdsutil on the command line to do it. Now a final point to make about our schema role is that even if it is down for a good period of time, it really won't make any difference to your normal day-to-day operations unless you want to extend the schema. So if it's down, it's down. It doesn't really matter anyway until you want to extend that schema. So if you do plan on installing a schema extending application, you'd better make sure that the server holding this role is up. Okay, well let's move on and we'll take a look at the other operations master roles that we have in Windows Server 2003. The next role we'll look at is the Domain Naming Operations Master role. The Domain Naming Operations Master is responsible for adding and removing domains in your forest. Like the Schema Master, there's only one Domain Naming Operations Master in your entire forest. And again, like the Schema role, the server holding this role could indeed be down and day-to-day operations will still function normally. Only when domains needed to be added or removed does the Domain Naming Operations Master kick in. So to see which server holds our domain naming role, we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll launch Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Okay, Now if we right click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts at the top here, we'll select Operations Masters. Now here we can see that the domain naming role is currently being held by Server01, which is the server that we're connected to here. So obviously we can't transfer it to itself. So I'll click on Close, and again we'll right click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts and choose to connect to another domain controller. Now of course we are currently connected to Server01, so I need to select a different domain controller in which I can transfer this role. So I'll select Server02 and choose OK. Now again we'll come up here and we'll right click on Active Directory Domains and Trusts and we'll choose Operations Masters. Okay, now we can see that our Domain Operations Master is currently being held by Server01. And we're currently connected to Server02. So to transfer the domain naming master role to Server02, we'll simply click on Change. Are we sure we want to do this? Yes. Now our operations master role has successfully transferred across to our Server02. And now we're free to shut down Server01 and start performing some routine maintenance. Okay, well the next role we'll look at is the PDC emulator role. The PDC Emulator Operations Master really has two functions. It's designed with Windows NT 4 domain controllers in mind because it serves to trick Windows NT 4 backup domain controllers or BDCs into thinking that there's a real Windows NT 4 primary domain controller on your network. The Windows 2003 server that holds the PDC emulator role will authenticate Windows NT logons and password changes and controls replication of domain changes to all other Windows NT 4 backup domain controllers that you have in your network. Now even if you don't have any NT 4 backup domain controllers on your network, the PDC emulator server is still there and it's still responsible for controlling password changes. Now what happens here is when a user's password is changed, this password change is sent to the local domain controller which accepts the change, and then it passes it on to the PDC emulator which is then responsible for authorizing the change. If it does authorize the change, then that new password is replicated to all other domain controllers. Now because there can be a delay during the time a password is changed and the time that all domain controllers have had the change replicated, whenever a user logs on, the local domain controller will always check the PDC emulator just in case there's been a password change that it doesn't yet know about. The PDC emulator does have another special power as well. It handles account locking or unlocking as well as high-speed password replication. Generally speaking, replication of any other Active Directory object doesn't happen quickly, but the two main exceptions are passwords and account lockouts. Now let's face facts here. If you enter in your password 3 times unsuccessfully and your account is locked out, what good is your security if you can attempt more logons again against another domain controller which hasn't yet had time to know that your account's locked out? Similarly, if you request a password change and the help desk connect to their local domain controller and change your password, and you try to log on with a password that's not yet replicated to your local domain controller, then you'll be denied access to that too. So that's the role of the PDC emulator. Besides replicating changes, it's the master of all changes relating to passwords and account lockouts. Before allowing or denying access, your local authenticating domain controller will check with our PDC emulator just to see if anything's changed. But the PDC emulator also serves one other purpose as well. It's the main timekeeper in your forest. That's right, the PDC emulator is responsible for forest-wide time synchronization. In our video on the Windows Time Service, we talk more about Windows Time, but the short version here is that your PDC emulator is the forest timekeeper. Now don't forget, if you have more than one domain in your forest, you'll have more than one PDC emulator. These PDC emulators will synchronize their time with each other. If they don't, then Kerberos authentication will fail. But there's one PDC emulator that is above all others, the master of time if you like, and that server is the first PDC emulator installed in the first domain inside your forest. All other PDC emulators in each of your domains will synchronize with this server. But as strange as it might sound, the master PDC doesn't have to synchronize with anything. In fact, it doesn't have to have the right time at all, although it probably should go without saying that if its time's out, then all the other PDC emulators will be out as well. So it can be a good idea to sync your master PDC against a reliable external time source to ensure that it does keep good, accurate time. Now, one final point is to make sure you set the time zone of each of your domain controllers to the correct time zone. If your master PDC emulator happens to be in London and you have domain controllers in Australia, if you don't set the time zones to be an accurate depiction of where they're situated geographically and just change the clocks to your local time, then when AD replicates, and it will do this in universal time by the way, then synchronization will fail as the time will be out of whack. So to transfer the PDC emulator to another server, we'll simply click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. And then we'll simply come over here and right click on our domain and we'll select Connect to Domain Controller. Now we're currently connected to Server 01, which holds our PDC emulator role, so we'll select Server 02 and then click on OK. Okay, now we can see that we're currently connected to Server 02, so again on the left hand side, we'll right click on our domain and we'll choose Operations Masters. Now we'll select the PDC tab and we can see that the PDC emulator role is currently being held by Server 01. So to transfer the PDC emulator role to our other server, Server 02, we'll simply click on Change. And do we want to transfer this role? Yes, we do. And we can see again our Operations Master role has successfully been transferred. Okay, the next Operations Master role is the RID, or Relative Identifier role. In Windows 2000 or 2003, each domain controller is capable of creating user, group, and computer accounts. Each account has something called a SID, or Security Identifier. Now a SID looks something like this. The first part of our SID, the S1521, is a value that applies to all SIDs. The next part is a value that's randomly generated. And this is the identifier of the domain. Whenever you create a new domain account, these numbers up until this point will always remain the same. If you happen to be creating a local account, however, you'll see that these numbers will be different. And finally, the last part is a number that the RID, or Relative Identifier, uniquely uses to identify the account that you're creating. This number will of course be different for each account. So if your domain controller needs to create a new account, it already knows what the first part's going to be. The only difference is the last part. The RID master is responsible for maintaining the distribution of these relative identifiers to each of your domain controllers. The RID master hands out these RID numbers in batches of 500 to each of your domain controllers. So when your local domain controller needs to create an account, it doesn't need to contact the RID master for an ID every time it needs to assign one to an account. It already has it and it just goes on happily creating a unique account. In fact, the RID master can be offline and accounts can still be created. The only time the RID master must be up is when the local domain controller needs to get more relative identifiers. Now, when the local domain controller only has about half of its relative IDs left, it'll contact the RID master and ask for more. Now, if the RID happens to be down and the local domain controller has run out of RIDs, then account creation will fail. Now, as this is a domain role, each domain will have a single RID master. So to transfer the RID role to another server, we'll simply click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now we're currently connected to server01.testdomain.com, which holds our RID role, so we'll come over here to the left hand side and right click on our domain and we'll choose to connect to a domain controller. Now we can see that we are connected to Server 01, so we need to connect to our other domain controller here, Server 02, so we'll select that from the list and click OK. Okay, our MMC is now changed to reflect the fact that we're now connected to Server 02, so again we'll right click on our test domain and we'll choose Operations Masters. Now here we can see on the RID tab that our operations master is currently server 01. So to transfer the role to server 02, we'll simply click on change. Are we sure we want to do this? We've seen this before. We'll choose yes. We can see our operations master role was successfully transferred across to server 02. So we'll click on OK. Okay, the final operations master role is the infrastructure role. The infrastructure master is responsible for updating cross-domain group-to-user references. When you change a user account or add a user to a group, these sorts of changes don't tend to show up in other domains for quite a while. It's the job of the infrastructure master to help speed up this process. The infrastructure master compares its data against what is stored in the global catalog. If it has outdated data, it updates the data and replicates it out to the other global catalog servers in the other domains. If the infrastructure master is down, these group-to-name references won't be available, and the net result is when a user's been added to a group that grants them access to a resource in another domain, the likely result is that access will be denied as the target domain has no idea that the user's group membership has changed. Now, as this is a domain role, each domain will have a single infrastructure master. So to transfer the infrastructure master role to another server, again, we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and we'll go back and launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now, as you can see, we're currently connected to server 01. So on the left-hand side here of our MMC, we'll right-click on our domain, testdomain.com, and we'll choose to connect to another domain controller. So we need to again connect to server 02 and choose OK. Okay, we can now see that we're now connected to server 02. So again, on the left-hand side of our MMC, we'll right-click on our domain and we'll choose Operations Masters. Then we'll come over here to the Infrastructure tab and we can see that server 01 currently does hold our infrastructure role. So to transfer it across to server 02, we'll click on Change. Are we sure we want to do this again? Yes, we are. And we can see that the operations role again has successfully transferred. So now we should see every single role that Windows 2003 domains have, all of the 5 roles, would now be transferred across to our server 02. So there you go. There you have the 5 different operations master roles available in Windows 2003. It's important to understand the importance that each role plays in your environment, as each can affect the successful operation of your network in their own way if they're not available. Transferring a role to another server is a pretty painless